The man who became a ghost. There is a particular kind of silence that is worse than noise. It is not the silence of a peaceful morning or the quiet of a sleeping house. It is the silence that comes when the world decides you no longer matter, when the people who once stood beside you begin to disappear one by one, like candles being blown out in a dark room. That was the silence that surrounded Alessandro Romano, and it was the loudest thing he had ever heard in his entire life. 6 months ago, the name Romano made grown men lower their eyes when they walked past. 6 months ago, business owners paid their dues without a single word of complaint because they knew what happened to those who did not. 6 months ago, 3 black cars always followed wherever Alessandro went, filled with men whose only purpose was to make sure that nothing in the world dared to touch him. He walked into rooms and conversations stopped. He sat down at tables and the best food arrived without him having to ask. He made phone calls that changed the direction of entire neighborhoods, entire businesses, entire lives. He was not just powerful. He was the kind of powerful that people whispered about when they thought no one was listening. And then came the night of the accident. Nobody spoke about it clearly. The story changed depending on who was telling it. Some said the car lost control on the wet road. Some said the brakes failed. Some said it was fate, which is what people say when they do not want to say the truth. What everyone agreed on was the result. The car went through a railing on the bridge, dropped several feet, and when the rescue workers finally pulled Alessandro Romano from the wreckage, he was alive, but the lower half of his body was not responding. The doctors used many careful words and long medical explanations, but what they meant was simple and brutal. He would never walk again. The news spread through the city like smoke. First it was whispers, then it was conversation, and then it was a kind of careful silence among the men who had once pledged their loyalty to him. Loyalty, it turned out, was a word that had a very specific meaning in his world. It meant loyalty to the man who could protect you, reward you, and punish those who crossed you. It did not mean loyalty to a man in a wheelchair who could not even stand up to shake your hand. The first to disappear were the outer circle. The drivers, the messengers, the men who ran small errands and collected small debts. They simply stopped showing up, and nobody called to ask where they had gone. Then the middle circle began to drift, finding reasons to be busy, finding other arrangements, other allegiances. Phone calls that used to be answered on the first ring now went to silence. Meetings that used to be scheduled weeks in advance simply never got scheduled at all. And the inner circle, the men he had trusted most, the men who had eaten at his table and looked him in the eye and told him they would die before they let anything happen to him, those men sent a single representative to deliver a polite and devastating message. The organization needed leadership. Things had to continue. He would be taken care of. He would want for nothing. But the day-to-day decisions, the real power that had to move on. They moved on, and they took everything with them. His family was different in the way that family always is. They hurt him in a different way, with a different texture of pain. His older brother Marco came to see him 3 times in the hospital. The visits were short and uncomfortable, filled with long pauses and conversations about nothing important. Marco sat on the edge of his chair as if he were afraid to settle in, as if settling in would mean committing to something he did not want to commit to. After the 3rd visit, he stopped coming. He sent money instead, which was its own kind of message. His cousins called on holidays and spoke in cheerful voices that were too cheerful, the kind of cheerful that people use when they are trying to get through a conversation as quickly as possible. His aunt, a woman who used to pinch his cheek and call him her favorite, sent a card with flowers on it that sat on the nightstand until the nurse eventually threw it away. His mother had died years before all of this happened, and for the first time in a long time he thought about her differently. He used to think she had been lucky to die before she had to see what he had become in his life, the choices he had made, the things he had done. Now he thought she was lucky for a different reason. She did not have to see this. She did not have to watch her son become invisible. The house he was moved into after leaving the hospital was one of his own properties, a large estate on the northern edge of the city with a long driveway lined with old oak trees. It had always been his most private residence, the one he used when he wanted to be away from everything. Now it became his world entirely, because the world outside had no particular interest in including him. The rooms were large and well-furnished and completely indifferent to his pain. There were high ceilings and tall windows and expensive things arranged in careful order, and none of it meant anything at all. He had a small staff, a cook who came in the mornings, prepared the day's meals, left them properly stored, and went home without much conversation. A physical therapist who came 3 times a week and guided him through exercises that were designed to preserve what function he had left and build strength in the parts of his body that still responded. The therapist was professional and efficient and spoke in measured clinical tones that kept everything at a safe emotional distance. And then there was the housekeeper. Her name was Gianna. She had worked for the Romano household for 11 years, long before the accident, long before everything fell apart. She was a quiet woman with careful hands and the particular kind of dignity that belongs to people who do hard work without complaint and without asking to be noticed for it. She came every morning at 7 and left every evening at 6, and she moved through the house doing what needed to be done with the same steady rhythm she had always had. She was not a warm person in any obvious way. She did not try to start conversations with him or offer him words of encouragement. She seemed to understand, perhaps better than most, that the wrong kind of kindness can feel like an insult to someone who is suffering. So she kept her distance, did her work, and treated him with a simple, solid respect that asked nothing of him in return. What Gianna had not mentioned, and what no one had thought to ask about, was that she sometimes brought her daughter to work with her. Not every day. Only on the days when school let out early, or when the regular arrangements for the child fell through, or when there was simply nowhere else for the little girl to go. On those days, Gianna's daughter came along and was supposed to stay in the kitchen or in the small side room near the back of the house where the staff kept their things. She was supposed to be quiet and invisible and stay out of the way. Her name was Lucia. She was 7 years old, and she was not very good at being invisible. The first time Alessandro became aware of her, he had been sitting alone in the large room that faced the back garden. It was mid-afternoon, and the light was coming through the tall windows in long, golden angles that made the dust in the air look like something beautiful. He had been staring at the garden without seeing it, which was something he did a great deal of in those days. He was thinking about nothing and everything simultaneously, that specific kind of mental paralysis that comes when a person cannot find a single direction to point themselves in. He heard a small sound near the door and turned his head, expecting to see Gianna or the cook, and instead found himself looking at a child, standing in the doorway with an expression on her face that he could not immediately read. She was small, with dark curly hair that was only partially contained by 2 uneven pigtails, and she was wearing a red dress with a small stain near the hem that looked like it might have been chocolate. She was looking at him with enormous brown eyes that held no fear whatsoever, which was startling because fear was the expression he was most accustomed to seeing on people's faces when they first encountered him, even now, even in a wheelchair. This child looked at him the way a person looks at something genuinely interesting, with open, unguarded curiosity. For a moment neither of them spoke. He was waiting for her to run away. She did not run away. "Are you the man who owns all the trees outside?" she asked, in a voice that was completely conversational, as if they had been in the middle of a discussion for some time. He stared at her. "What?" he said, because it was the only thing he could think to say. "The big trees in front," she said, stepping slightly further into the room. "There are 12 of them. I counted. Are they yours?" "Yes," he said after a pause. "They are mine." She nodded slowly, processing this information with great seriousness. "Do you have a name for them?" she asked. "Trees do not have names," he said. "Mine do," she told him simply, as if this were a perfectly ordinary piece of information, which to her it clearly was. "I name everything. My shoes have names. My pencil has a name. His name is Bernard." He did not know what to do with any of this. He had not had a real conversation in weeks. He had exchanged words with the physical therapist about range of motion and muscle response. He had exchanged words with Gianna about things that needed to be cleaned or fixed or arranged. He had exchanged clipped, painful words with his brother and his cousins about nothing that mattered. But he had not had a conversation, not really, not the kind where something unexpected happened, and you did not know what was coming next. "Go back to the kitchen," he said. His voice came out harder than he intended, which was something that happened often now. He had spent so many years making his voice hard on purpose that it had become his default, even when he did not particularly mean it. She blinked. "Okay," she said, and left. He expected that to be the end of it. It was not the end of it. The next day she appeared in the doorway again, at almost the same time in the afternoon, wearing a different dress but the same uneven pigtails. She was holding something in both hands, and when she stepped a little closer, he could see that it was a drawing. It was a drawing of trees, rendered in crayon with significant enthusiasm and very little concern for proportion. They were enormous green shapes with round tops and stick branches, and written underneath in careful, slightly wobbly letters were names. Not the trees' names, the names she had given them. There was one called Stefano, and one called Bella, and one that appeared to be called Mr. Big. "I brought you this," she said, holding it out to him, "so you can remember what they look like." "I can see the trees from this window," he said. "Yes," she agreed, "but in case you forget." He took the drawing because she was holding it out with such complete confidence that he would want it that there was no socially intelligible way to refuse. He looked at it for a moment and then set it down on the side table next to him. She watched him do this with an expression of quiet satisfaction. "My name is Lucia," she said. "My mama works here." "I know who your mother is," he said. "What is your name?" she asked. He looked at her. It had been a very long time since anyone had asked him that question without already knowing the answer. "Alessandro," he said. "That is a very long name," she observed. "Yes," he agreed, "it is." "Can I call you Al?" she asked. Nobody had called him that since he was a boy. His mother used to call him that a long time ago in a different life. Something about hearing it again, even from this small stranger, moved through him in a way he could not explain and did not want to examine. "No," he said, though his voice was slightly less hard this time. "You may call me Mr. Romano." "Okay, Mr. Romano," she said easily, without any sign of offense. And then she sat down on the floor near the window and took a small book out of the pocket of her dress and began reading it with great concentration, as if she were simply an ordinary part of the room. "What are you doing?" he asked after several minutes. "Reading," she said without looking up. "I can see that," he said. "Why are you reading in here?" She looked up then and gave him a look that was patient and slightly puzzled, the way a person looks when they are being asked a question that should be obvious. "Because you are in here," she said, as if this were the most natural explanation in the world, and then she went back to her book. He did not send her away again that day. He told himself it was because it was not worth the argument, which was not entirely true. Gina discovered what her daughter had been doing on the fourth day, and the apology she brought with her was the most genuinely distressed thing he had ever seen from her. She stood in the doorway of the room with her hands clasped in front of her, and told him in a carefully controlled voice that Lucia would not bother him anymore, that she had spoken to her, that she was deeply sorry for any disruption the child had caused. Her eyes were steady, but her hands were tight, and he understood that she was afraid. Not of him exactly, not the way the men had been afraid. She was afraid of losing her job. She was afraid for her daughter. She was afraid of the wrong word from him changing the shape of their lives. "It is fine," he said, and because he was out of practice with kindness, it came out flat and without warmth. But he said it again, slightly differently. "She is not a problem, Gina. Let her come if she wants to." Gina stood there for a moment, clearly uncertain whether to be relieved or more worried. Then she nodded once, thanked him in a quiet voice, and went back to her work. Lucia came back the next day and the day after that, and slowly, gradually, in the way that only children can manage because they have no self-consciousness about the process, she began to dismantle the wall he had built around himself. She did not do it through grand gestures or meaningful speeches. She did it through small, consistent, completely ordinary things. She brought him drawings. She told him about her school day in exhaustive and thoroughly entertaining detail, including long descriptions of the complicated social politics of the second grade that were, in their own way, not so different from the complicated social politics of his former life. She asked him questions that no adult would ever think to ask, questions like whether he thought fish were happy, and whether clouds got tired of floating, and what his favorite color was and why. He told her the truth about his favorite color, which was dark blue, because it was the color of the sea in winter when it looked serious and deep. She considered this for a long time and then told him that her favorite color was yellow because it was the color of things that were trying their hardest to be cheerful, and he laughed. He actually laughed out loud, for the first time in so long that the sound surprised him and surprised her, and filled the large, indifferent room with something it had not had in a very long time. She began asking him about his life, not in a probing way, but in the way children ask about everything, out of pure and unlimited curiosity. She wanted to know if he had been to the sea, and he told her yes many times. She wanted to know if he had ever been on an airplane, and he told her yes many times. She wanted to know if he had friends, and he paused at that question longer than he had paused at any other, and she waited because she was better at waiting than most adults he had ever known. "I had many people around me," he said finally. "Whether they were friends, I am not sure I knew the difference at the time." She absorbed this with the same serious attention she gave to everything he said. "I have 4 real friends," she told him. "I know they are real because they still like me even when I am boring." He thought about that for the rest of the day after she had gone home with her mother, and something about it settled into him like a stone settling to the bottom of still water. He thought about all the people who had surrounded him, all the noise and movement and energy of his former life, and he tried to count the ones who would have still been there if he had been boring, if he had been powerless, if he had had nothing to offer and nothing to threaten. And the number he arrived at was very small, and one of them was a 7-year-old girl in a red dress who named her pencil Bernard. The physical therapist came on Tuesday and noted with careful professional neutrality that his engagement during the session was better than it had been in weeks. He was doing the exercises with more attention, more intention, more willingness to push through discomfort. She did not ask what had changed because it was not her job to ask, but she noticed, and she noted it in her records. What had changed was Lucia. She had asked him one afternoon with her characteristic directness if the exercises hurt, and he had told her sometimes yes. She had asked him if he still did them even when they hurt, and he had said yes. She had looked at him with an expression of quiet admiration that was entirely unperformed and said, "That is very brave," in a voice so simple and so certain that he had felt it in a way that was hard to describe. Nobody had called him brave in years. They had called him powerful and ruthless and dangerous and effective, but brave was a different thing. Brave was something you were when you were fighting something that might beat you, and she saw that. She saw exactly what he was fighting, and she called him brave for fighting it. But then came the afternoon when Lucia did something that changed everything. She had been sitting beside him near the window, going through a box of old photographs she had found on the shelf, and was examining with the absolute freedom of someone who is too young to understand that some things are private. She turned the photos over one by one, asking who this person was and who that person was, and he found himself answering, telling her small stories about each face, pulling up memories he had stored away in dark corners and letting them come into the light. And then she stopped on one photograph and held it up and asked with her usual directness, "Who broke your car?" He went very still. "What?" he said. "This car," she said, pointing at the photograph. It was a picture of him standing beside his car, the one from the accident, taken at a celebration of some kind perhaps a year before everything happened. "Mama says this is the car you were in. Who broke it?" "It was an accident," he said carefully. She looked at the photograph for a long moment, her small face very serious. "My mama says accidents happen by themselves," she said slowly, "but this one didn't happen by itself, did it?" She looked up at him with those wide brown eyes that missed nothing. "Someone helped it happen." The room was completely quiet. The afternoon light was falling through the windows, and for the first time since the night of the accident, someone had said out loud the thing that he had been carrying in silence, the thing that sat at the bottom of every sleepless night and every bitter morning. Because the brakes had not simply failed. He had known it in the hospital, lying in the dark with tubes in his arm and the sound of machines around him. He had known it, and he had said nothing because the knowing without proof was the most dangerous thing in the world. And because some part of him, the part that had been broken along with his spine, had simply stopped caring. Lucia was still looking at him, waiting, the photograph in her small hands, and he understood in that moment that this child, this small, fearless, completely ordinary child, had just unlocked something inside him that 6 months of silence had sealed shut. What did Lucia see in that photograph that a grown man refused to look at? And why, in the days that followed, did a black car begin appearing at the end of the long driveway lined with oak trees, watching, waiting, as if the people who thought they had ended one chapter were beginning to realize that the story was not over? The truth in small hands. There is a moment that happens between winter and spring that most people miss because they are not paying attention closely enough. It is not a dramatic moment. There is no single morning where you wake up and everything is suddenly warm and bright and full of promise. Instead, it happens in small increments, almost invisibly. One day the light stays a little longer than it did the day before. One day the cold has a slightly different quality to it, less sharp, less final, as if it is becoming uncertain of itself. One day you notice something green at the edge of the garden that was not there the week before, something small and stubborn and entirely convinced of its right to exist. That is how spring actually arrives, through quiet persistence rather than grand announcement, and that is also how change arrived in the life of Alessandro Romano. It had been nearly 3 weeks since Lucia had held up that photograph and asked the question that cracked something open in him. 3 weeks during which he had not slept in the way a person normally sleeps, but instead spent his nights in the particular suspended state of a mind that is working hard on something it cannot quite bring to the surface. He would lie in the large, quiet room and watch the ceiling and follow one thought to another and another, going back over the night of the accident, going back over the months before it, looking at faces and words and decisions with new eyes. The eyes, he was discovering, of a man who had nothing left to protect and therefore nothing left to be afraid of. Because that was the thing about losing everything. It removed a certain kind of fear. When he had been powerful, he had understood in the back of his mind that there were people who might want to take that power from him. But understanding something in the back of your mind and feeling it fully are very different experiences. He had moved through his life with the particular confidence of a man who believed that his protections were sufficient, that his inner circle was genuinely his, that the loyalty he had built and paid for and enforced was real in some meaningful way. The accident had educated him, slowly and painfully, about the difference between obedience and loyalty, and between presence and genuine allegiance. Lucia came to see him every afternoon on the days she accompanied her mother to the estate, which was now more days than not because Gianna, in her quiet and practical way, had begun bringing the child with her consistently. He had not asked for this directly. He was not the kind of man who asked for things directly when it came to his own needs. But Gianna was perceptive in the way of someone who has spent years attending to the needs of others, and she had noticed the change in him on the days when Lucia was there versus the days when she was not. On the days with Lucia, he ate more, sat up straighter, moved through his exercises with more intention, and occasionally produced an expression that the cook, a round-faced woman named Rita who was completely unimpressed by his history and reputation, described to Gianna in the kitchen as almost like a normal person. On the days without Lucia, the shadow came back, settling over him like fog. So Gianna brought her daughter more often, saying nothing about it, making no ceremony of it, simply adjusting the practical arrangements of their life to accommodate something she had decided mattered. This was one of the many things he was beginning to understand about Gianna, and by extension about the kind of people who had always been in the background of his life without him truly seeing them. She acted from values that were clear and constant, and not subject to negotiation, not because those values brought her any obvious reward, but simply because they were hers, and she was not the kind of person who abandoned what was hers when circumstances became difficult. Lucia, for her part, was conducting what seemed to be a thorough and entirely self-directed investigation of the estate. She had progressed from the main sitting room to the hallway to the library, which she described as the room where books go to wait for someone to need them. She had examined every room she could access with the systematic attention of a small scientist, and she had begun bringing him her findings in the form of detailed reports delivered each afternoon when she settled herself into the chair beside his wheelchair near the window. "I found a room with 43 books about history," she told him one afternoon, her feet dangling from the chair because they did not quite reach the floor. "And also one book about birds and one book about cheese, which I think were put there by mistake." "I was interested in cheese for a period," he told her. He was not entirely sure why he told her this, except that she had a way of asking or saying things that made honesty feel like the most natural response. "Were you interested in birds?" she asked. "No," he said. "Then the bird book is definitely a mistake," she concluded, with the satisfied tone of a mystery resolved. It was on one of these afternoon report sessions that Lucia brought up the photograph again. She had been thinking about it, she told him, in the direct and unashamed way she announced most things. She had been thinking about what he had not said when she asked him who broke his car. She had been thinking about his face when she asked the question, and about the way the room had gotten very quiet. "I did not answer you," he said. "No," she agreed. She was looking at him with her clear, patient eyes. "But that was the answer," she said. He looked at this child, this 7-year-old who named her pencil Bernard and counted the trees in the driveway, and he felt something that he had not felt in a very long time. He felt seen. Not seen in the way his men had seen him, as a source of power and direction. Not seen in the way his family saw him, as an obligation and a complication. Seen in the way that requires another person to actually look at you without any agenda other than the seeing itself. There are things, he said carefully, that are complicated, Lucia, things that are not simple to explain. Complicated things are okay, she said. I can understand complicated things. I understood long division. He almost smiled. This is more complicated than long division, he said. Show me with small words, she told him. Small words are better anyway. He was quiet for a long time, and she waited, and outside the tall windows the old oak trees moved slightly in the afternoon wind, the ones she had named Stefano and Bella and Mr. Big and the others, their branches tracing slow shapes against the pale sky. And he began to talk. Not everything, not the full shape of all of it, but the edges of it, the outline, in the simplest words he could find, because she had asked for small words, and he had discovered that small words forced a kind of honesty that large, complicated ones could hide behind. He told her that he had once been a man with a great deal of power, and that power like that made people want things from you, and that some of those people, when they decided they wanted the power for themselves, would do very terrible things to take it. He told her that he had thought the people closest to him were the ones he could trust, but that he had been wrong in a way that cost him more than he had known how to prepare for. He told her that the accident was not entirely an accident, and that he had known this, but had not been able to do anything with that knowing because the part of him that used to know what to do with problems had gone very quiet after the hospital. Lucia listened to all of this without interrupting, which was unusual for her, and when he finished, she sat with it for a moment in the careful way she sometimes did when something required proper consideration. The people closest to you, she said at last, one of them did it. He did not confirm or deny, but he did not look away from her, and she read his stillness with an accuracy that continued to astonish him. Okay, she said, in a voice that was simple and calm and full of a seriousness that belonged to someone much older. Then we need to find out which one. He stared at her. Lucia, he said, this is not something for you to worry about. This is not a problem for a child. You said the same thing about fractions, she told him with complete confidence, and I learned fractions just fine. This is not fractions, he said. No, she agreed, but the idea is the same. You take what seems impossible and you break it into smaller pieces, and then the pieces are not so impossible. She tilted her head to one side. My teacher says that is how you solve any problem. He sat with that for a long moment, and then he said, Your teacher sounds like a wise woman. She is all right, Lucia said generously. She does not like it when people talk during reading time, which is excessive in my opinion, but otherwise she is reasonable. In the days that followed, something began to shift in him that went beyond the small daily improvements the physical therapist was noting in her records. Something deeper was reorganizing itself, some fundamental orientation toward his own situation that had been pointed entirely inward, and downward was slowly, painfully, turning outward and forward. It had started with Lucia's question about the photograph. It continued with her matter-of-fact declaration that they needed to find out which one. And it was sustained by something that happened the following week that he had not expected and could not have predicted. It was a Thursday morning, earlier than Lucia usually arrived, and he had been in the middle of his physical therapy session when Gianna appeared in the doorway of the exercise room with an expression on her face that he had not seen from her before. Not fear exactly, though there was something in it adjacent to fear. It was the expression of a woman who has decided to do something difficult and is committed to doing it before the courage leaves her. I need to speak with you, she said, and her voice was completely steady, which somehow made the expression on her face more serious rather than less. The therapist, trained to read rooms, quietly excused herself and pulled the door mostly shut. Gianna came into the room and stood a few feet from him, and for a moment she looked at the floor in the way of a person organizing their thoughts, and then she looked up and met his eyes directly. I have been working in this house for 11 years, she said. I have seen many things. I have kept my own counsel about those things because it was not my place, and because I had my daughter to think about, and because the kind of trouble that comes with speaking openly in a house like this one is not trouble I could afford. She paused. But I have a daughter who sits with you every day and asks you questions that I cannot answer. And I think you deserve to know that I have been carrying something, and that I should have told you before now, and that I am sorry it took me this long." The room was very quiet. Outside, a bird was making a persistent sound in one of the oak trees. "Tell me," he said, and his voice was steady and quiet, the voice he used when something important was happening, and he needed his whole attention for it. What Jaina told him in the next 20 minutes reorganized everything. She had heard things, she said. Small things over time, things that alone meant little but together meant a great deal. A conversation between two of his inner circle men 3 weeks before the accident, held in the hallway outside the kitchen when they believed she was in the garden, about timing and about a particular stretch of road, and about how the situation would sort itself out naturally if circumstances aligned correctly. She had not understood it fully at the time, or perhaps she had not allowed herself to understand it, which she acknowledged with a quiet honesty that cost her something. She had heard the name of one man specifically, spoken in the context of a word that meant the project, which was the way these men sometimes spoke about things they did not want to name directly. The name was not someone from the outer circle. It was not someone from the middle distance of his operation. It was someone he had grown up with, someone who had been with him since before any of this had started, someone whose children he knew by name, someone who had stood beside him at his mother's funeral and put a hand on his shoulder and said the words that people say at funerals and that he had believed, genuinely believed, were sincere. He sat with the name for a long time after Jaina finished speaking, and she stood quietly and let him sit with it, which was perhaps the kindest thing anyone had done for him in months. She did not fill the silence with reassurance or apology or additional words. She simply let him have the weight of it, which was what the weight required. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked at last. Jaina was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Because my daughter comes home every day talking about how brave you are. And because if she is right, and I believe she is, then you deserve to know the truth about what happened to you." The physical therapist came back, knocked softly, and resumed the session. But everything about the session was different from that point forward. He pushed harder, moved with more intention, drove through the pain with a focus that made the therapist blink and recalibrate her assessment of where his limits actually were. Because the limits, it turned out, were not where the pain was. The limits were where the purpose was, or rather where the purpose was absent, and in the last hour, purpose had come back into the room. Lucia came that afternoon as usual, dropped her bag by the chair, climbed up, and settled in with the easy comfort of someone returning to a familiar place. She looked at him with the assessment she had developed over weeks of careful observation and said without preamble, "Something happened today." "Yes," he said. She waited. "Your mother is a very remarkable woman," he said. Lucia considered this with the thoughtful gravity she brought to statements that required proper acknowledgement. "Yes," she said. "I know, she makes the best rice in the city and she never tells lies and she is not afraid of anything." She paused. "She is afraid of spiders a little, but that is reasonable." "Yes," he said, "that is reasonable." There was a comfortable quiet between them, the kind of quiet that only happens between people who have gotten past the awkward stage and arrived somewhere more settled. Outside, the light was beginning to soften toward evening. The oaks were long shadows now across the garden. "Mr. Romano," Lucia said. "Yes," he said. "Are you going to be okay?" she asked, and the question was so simple and so direct and so completely without any subtext that it took him a moment to receive it properly. Not okay in the complicated adult sense of the word, not okay meaning will you recover your power or your position or your place in the world. Just okay. The small, essential human meaning of the word. He thought about Jaina standing in the exercise room with her hands at her sides, and the truth coming out of her after 11 years. He thought about Lucia sitting in the big chair with her feet dangling, and her enormous eyes seeing everything he tried not to show. He thought about the name he now carried, the name of the person who had decided that his life was an obstacle to be removed. He thought about the photograph and the question that had opened the door. He thought about the long driveway and the oak trees that now had names because a small girl had decided that everything deserved a name, that everything deserved to be known. "Yes," he said, and for the first time in 6 months he meant it. "I think I am going to be okay." Lucia nodded, satisfied, and opened her book. The last light came through the tall windows. The room was quiet in the good way, the rare way, the way that feels like something rather than nothing. but 3 miles across the city, in an office with expensive furniture and no photographs on the walls, a phone rang. And the man who answered it listened for a moment and then said in a careful, controlled voice, "He is asking questions again." There was a pause. "Then we may need to revisit the situation." And outside the estate, at the very end of the long driveway between the oak trees, a black car sat in the gathering dark, its engine running, its lights off, watching the windows of the house where a little girl and a man in a wheelchair were sitting quietly in the last of the afternoon light, neither of them knowing yet how much danger that simple act of kindness had already set into motion. The truth was found, but the truth, once found, demands something of the person who finds it. And there are people in this city who have spent 6 months building a new world on top of the ruins of his old one, and who have no intention of letting any part of that old world come back to life. What happens next will test everything, especially the one thing nobody expected to matter at all, the bond between a broken man and the small girl who refused to look away.